Okay, welcome back to Case Studies with Caleb. We are starting our second case study patient here. And so I've written up the patient's demographics and kind of main complaints so that we can have a better idea of what we're getting into before we start. So this is going to be a series on JM, a 46-year-old female. She's unsure of menopausal status because she's been on birth control for so long that she hasn't had a normal cycle to be able to tell. So her chief complaints are fatigue, low libido, weight gain, insomnia, PMS, and digestive problems. Pretty large array of complaints there. As far as lifestyle goes, her diet at initial consultation was not restricted, and she was taking 40 milligrams of a proton pump inhibitor, esmeprazole, one of them, every day to abate the reflux symptoms that she was having. So as far as exercise goes, she walks and jogs 4 to 5 times a week. Sleep is subjectively poor, and she has to take temazepam every night to sleep. As far as stress management goes, she's an inconsistent meditator. So she started to practice at one point, but was not consistent with it to the point where she was actually, I would say, getting extraordinary benefit. Overall, her goals, as we can see down here, improve digestion, improve energy. She wants to discontinue her oral contraceptive and the PPI, as well as balance her hormones. Okay, so let's dive into her first lab report. Alrighty. So from a cardiometabolic perspective, we have a couple high things just off the bat: HSCRP and oxidized LDL. So, the HSCRP is a surrogate for interleukin-6, which can be, it's a broad inflammatory marker. It's not specific, and it could be from intense exercise or a sinus infection, rheumatoid arthritis. Any kind of inflammatory process is going to produce interleukin-6, which is going to go to the liver and instigate the creation of high sensitive, or just CRP. Oxidized LDL, on the other hand, is indicative of an inflammatory oxidative process happening in the serum that is oxidizing her low-density lipoproteins. And that is not good, because the more ox-LDL you have, the more chance of that causing an inflammatory infiltration into the vascular endothelium and creating a plaque. So homocysteine is also elevated. Glucose is on the higher end of the normal range. RBC folate's nice, and omega check is low as well. All things that we can optimize relatively simply. CMP, okay, rather creatinine be low than high. Liver enzymes look good, and GFR is wonderful. Estrogen's low, so even with the OCP, there's no improper metabolism going on there. She's on a dual, I think it's a biphasic. I think she's on a yeah. She's on it for 3 weeks, and then she takes a hormone holiday for the end to actually have a period, even though she doesn't have the periods on that week off. Scratch that. She doesn't do the holiday. She takes it straight through. IGF is right on. Okay. Iron's good. Okay, so here we have a possible big contributor to her inflammatory status, her gastrointestinal problems, and a whole array of other things, right? So this tissue transglutaminase antibody, IgG, is it's an enzyme that it has to do with gluten or deamidating gluten, but it doesn't really have anything to do with gluten in the big picture, right? It's an enzyme class that does a number of different things for connective tissue and the like. So the fact that it's elevated means we've got an immune disposition to develop antibodies against, and this is where gluten comes into play, a TTG gliadin complex. So it's not necessarily the gluten that's the problem. It's when the gluten is getting an enzymatic cleavage of one of its groups, but it binds, and then that new antigen is presented as a foreign body, and it gets attacked. Because even down here, we can see that gliadin itself has very little, I mean, this is pretty negative, antibodies to gliadin. So this is a true autoimmune picture, not a gluten sensitivity, which is a little bit more serious on the cutting out gluten and probably dairy. All right, so from a CBC, we have good. Nothing super concerning here. I'm going to keep an eye on that because the RBCs are not optimal for having an iron that optimized. Oops. Okay, gosh darn it. Okay, moving on. Neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio is a little bit higher than I'd like to see, but everyone's different. Okay. A little dehydrated here. And it looks like she had an asymptomatic UTI. So, with asymptomatic UTIs, it's one of those gray areas. Do you treat it? Do you not treat it? I don't believe we did anything at this point. I think one of our thoughts was to balance hormones, which will reinvigorate the flora, the vaginal flora, which make a pH that is conducive to, not conducive to the growth of pathogenic microbes. So we're going to tackle that in a roundabout way and not do any antibiotics for the time being. Okay. Moving on. All right. So again, we see the elevated CRP, but it's not due to an arthritic process. So we can rule that out as one of the causes of that elevated CRP. Her ANA is negative also, so she doesn't have a connective tissue autoimmune process going on either. And I normally don't run these kinds of tests, but it was another provider that ordered these, and they're nice. You can get a good picture, but as we can see, everything is negative. If we would have just stopped at doing the tissue transglutaminase antibodies, then we wouldn't have had to continue on with all of these other specialized tests. Okay. So it's always important to kind of set out your priorities when you're ordering lab work and see if there's an algorithm that you can process through. Do you want to cast the wide net if finances aren't a issue, or do you want to kind of systematically approach it to where, you know, one thing isn't positive, so you move on to the next thing, and kind of go accordingly. But sidebar, thyroid profile, you know, just off of first principles, everything looks normal, but she is fatigued. So we have to take that into account too. We're not going to do anything with thyroid now. I always like to address sex hormones first and see how that affects the thyroid axis afterwards. That's just my personal preference. And now we get down to sex hormones. So estradiol at 10 picograms per ml. That's very low. All right. So her birth control is suppressing FSH and LH. So it's suppressing ovulation through these synthetic hormones, progestin and ethinyl estradiol, but it's not showing up as estradiol, or estrone, right? So we don't know where it's going. It's a very low dose, right? All these OCPs are super low dose, and it's really the progestin that kind of goes up and does this gonadotropin suppression. So regardless, DHEA is nice. Sex hormone globulin is quite high, especially in light of having so low estradiol, because typically estrogen is what drives that sex hormone binding globulin up, and testosterone will decrease it. So why this is still elevated, it's a question we have right now. Cortisol is elevated. Now she is on, I should have mentioned this, she takes Adderall, I believe, 40 milligrams a day. So, she's definitely pushing her HPA axis with those amphetamines. And she's been on that for a very long time because of an ADHD diagnosis. But, what that's doing overall to her HPA axis, her DHEA looks like it's producing, her adrenals look like it's producing enough DHEA. She's not depleted in any sense. Now she is fatigued, so she could be in that kind of later phase of symptomatic adrenal deficiency, I would say. From a brain perspective, she's getting the right signals, right? So obviously her axis is making enough ACTH to stimulate the cortisol production from the adrenal glands. So there's no primary deficiency, there's no secondary deficiency, but the tertiary, where she's subjectively feeling it, is the level of analysis that we're playing at in regard to her adrenal problem. So it doesn't seem to be an adrenal problem. So despite having a high testosterone, this high sex hormone binding globulin is going to functionally limit the amount of free. I like women's free to be at 1 to 2%. So we would, kind of want this to be at 0.75 at a minimum. Her progesterone is also very low, but that's to be expected because she's not ovulating, right? You can't have progesterone if you're not ovulating. Okay, and this normal pregnenolone also backs up the thesis of normal adrenal function in HPA, even though the cortisol is a bit high. Okay, so that wraps up the first lab test that we did for her, and that was, I believe, in March. So the interventions initially that we were going to do is eliminate gluten and dairy. Now, dairy is a bystander here. We don't have any empirical data to suggest that she should be off of dairy, except that dairy is and whey and casein are inflammatory to the gastrointestinal barrier, regardless of who you are, right? So whether or not you have an immunological reaction to those proteins, there's some evidence that just like gluten, some of the dairy proteins and peptides will damage microvilli. Now, in the normal population, it could be a hormetic response, right? So if I drink dairy and I don't have any problems, it might be a good stress for my gut to undergo. Now, for someone who has digestive complaints and an autoimmune tissue process going on, then we want to reduce as much inflammatory triggers as possible. So, dairy is not something that we're going to, or the elimination of dairy is not something that we're going to marry at this point. But gluten being out of the picture is definitely something that I'm going to suggest she stop in the long term. Digestive enzymes with meals, just to see if that symptomatically improves her issues. Now with the PPI and the digestive enzymes containing hydrochloric acid, they're kind of working at odds. So, you always have to be aware that if you add digestive enzymes and someone is on a acid blocking medication, that they could have rebound reflux, and it could be kind of bad. So you always warn them. You say, at this point, we're not trying to taper her off of the PPI, that we will do later. But, she can continue to take the PPI with the digestive enzymes just to make sure that she can actually break down the food that she's getting so that it's not passing through, the duodenum and getting into the small intestine as a larger protein than needs to be, right? It's because those partially broken down food antigens are what kind of instigate immunological responses by those sampling dendritic cells and all that. Now, the next thing we did was start a multivitamin, broad spectrum multivitamin. It's liposomal, so I have her pulse it Monday through Friday. And this was to see if, in addition to the dietary changes, if we could change some of that homocysteine and some of the oxidative parameters that we saw early in the cardiometabolic domain. The last step is kind of the most, not invasive, but drastic. All right, so we agreed that she would stop the over-the-counter, or not over-the-counter, oral contraceptive medication for a month, and then we would redraw the blood to see what her gonadal axis was doing. Because, we can't, I didn't want to just start a hormone replacement compound without knowing what kind of numbers that she'd be generating by herself. So whenever we take another look at these labs from a month from now, we'll be able to kind of ascertain what hormones she needs support with and what she does not. And we'll see, from a mood perspective, what happens with her stopping the OCP, and then we're also looking for, changes in her menstrual cycle and things like that as well. So be sure to tune in for the next one, and if you haven't, please go and subscribe to the page and share the videos if you think someone would be interested in these kinds of reviews and conversations. So as always, comments are welcome, and until next time.